Now that the dust has settled on George Osborne's big day out, the autumn statement can be surveyed with both the benefit of a little distance and the interpretation of the Institute of Fiscal Studies, which follows the autumn statement as night follows day. Yes, growth is up and the benefits bill is down. But how does it feel for you? Are people better off? The Tories said yes, Labour said no, and the IFS is with Labour on this one. But is the economy motoring again? Here's Newsnight's very own Del Boy, Andy Verity.
If this little robin reliant with the economy, it's a lot nippier than we thought. It's had a few dodgy years, but there's no doubt it's picking up speed. Today, though, the Chancellor's claim that we're feeling the benefits of that was challenged. Here's how the official forecasts for economic growth have changed in 8 months. For this year, from 0.6% to 1.4%, and for next year, from 1.8 to 2.4.
Just 6 months ago, it looked as if we were stalling, black smoke pouring out the back of the exhaust. We look like a write-off. Now we're cruising along at a fast old speed. We are the fastest growing major economy.
And the faster growth is driving the deficit down. As income tax and VAT rolls in, less is being spent on benefits. But are we feeling the recovery? Labour's claim is that working people are today on average £1,600 a year worse off than when David Cameron took power in real terms. Yesterday, George Osborne seemed to refute that.
And yes, real household disposable income is rising.
But today, the Independent Institute for Fiscal Studies said the Chancellor's numbers didn't show quite what they seemed to.
Real household disposable income is forecast by the OER to have increased by about 0.5% in 2013. But the population is also increasing, so the income per person is actually forecast to fall very slightly, which might seem at odds with what George Osborne has been saying. According to the measure of household disposable income per person, incomes in 2016 will be very little higher than they were back in 2006. That's 10 years without growth.
So now we're in the city, close to the Bank of England. And the trouble with the city is, as soon as the car starts to get going, it starts to fret that it's going to overheat. And then the Bank of England might slam on the brakes. The bank said interest rates won't rise while unemployment's above 7%. So how soon might it fall below that? At the budget in March, the forecast was that it would take 3 years. Yesterday, the Office for Budgetary Responsibility said unemployment would fall much faster and then stay above 7% for a year, calming fears of interest rate rises.
The supposedly independent Office of Budget Responsibility has this unemployment rate which has been plummeting, well, falling steadily, suddenly flatlining just above the threshold that the Bank of England promised they wouldn't raise interest rates until it fell below. So it may be that they've kind of nudged the forecast to avoid alarming the markets, who are very nervous at the moment.
Have we just jump-started the old economic model, the one that crashed, the three-wheeled economy of house prices, spending and debt? Tesco recently blamed its falling sales on pressure on the consumer. But in fact, consumer spending is lovely jubbly. Consumer spending grew at its fastest pace for 3 years in the last quarter, and so did the economy. Consumer spending is what's driving it. But hang on, if real incomes aren't growing and consumer spending is, how do you square that? There's one answer: debt. We'd like to replace our debt-fueled economy with a new model, but households owe a record $1.4 trillion. Official numbers show business investment barely rising, exports down, and 5 years more of austerity. No souped-up engine yet, but a very nice paint job. Kirsty.
Andrew Verity. Well, I'm joined now by Phil Collins of The Times and Janine Ganesh from the Financial Times. Let's deal first with the Conservatives. You know, the economy growing, benefits bills down, essentially stick with the Conservatives to get the job done. Yeah,
and if there's another 2.5% of growth next year and inflation comes down a bit, that argument looks pretty strong in the months leading up to the election. I actually don't think that growth is their winning issue, though. I think their winning issue is the deficit. As long as the central subject of British politics is the deficit, Labour have a credibility problem, and George Osborne's job this week was to restore that issue to the centre of politics.
So the fact that the public doesn't really care that the deficit 2010, it was 60 million, 60 million, wow, 60 billion, we forget, 120 and then down 9, that's okay then. I mean,
Well, it's not okay, but it is, I think Jenna's right, that will be the central question if Osborne can define it as such. And it was very interesting what happened to Labour in the autumn statement today, because the Labour position reminds me of the old speechwriter's joke, we're on the edge of an abyss, now let's take a big step forward. Because they walked straight into it. Because ever since the last election, Labour's pitch has been, this government is ruining the economy, making it worse with austerity. And of course, you're a terrible hostage to fortune to some good numbers. And George Osborne, for the first time, had a few good numbers to bring to the House of Commons, and Ed Balls was in a terrible position.
Yeah, but
he was marooned with nothing to say.
No, but he had a good position, but of course the IFS then blew that out of the water, said Labour actually, on the basis that whatever it is, 1,400 a year worse off, was actually the correct figure, but it doesn't have any traction.
No, but I think what matters is the trend. So if the economy generally and people's personal circumstances are even marginally improving in the last 6 months of the Parliament, I'm not sure they'll remember what happened 4 years earlier. So I think the last 6 to 9 months are disproportionately important in any Parliament. But
I mean, he's playing a short game anyway, isn't he? He just wants to tell us what it's going to be like by 2015.
Exactly. And obviously we would like him, and Phil wrote a very good column this week saying, he should think ahead to infrastructure and investment in the future. But really, his political incentive is to get it right over the next 18 months.
But for a sustained recovery, you want a massive increase in business investment. It's up 1%. You don't want a recovery based on personal debt and a housing boom, do you?
I think that's right. I think the one line of attack, which is absolutely credible, is the fragility of the recovery. It could be built on sand. So I think the debt-fueled nature of it is extremely worrying. However, we've got to look at the timescale here. It's not that long until the next election, and that every incentive for the politician is to look at their horizon is 2 years hence. So the big question for Labour is whether those two things, the economy in aggregate on the one hand and living standards on the other, come together or not. Labour's trying to separate them, because they're saying we have a credibility problem on economic growth. However, we're more trusted on the idea that we might be able to put money in your pocket. And they're separating those two things.
But that is actually, I mean, there's a lot of psychology around, but actually a lot of that is dependent on whether or not you trust the central character in the Labour story. And the central character in this Labour story is not Ed Miliband, it's Ed Balls.
Yeah, but people do talk about removing Ed Balls as though it's the most frictionless, stress-free thing you can do in politics. I think Ed Miliband knows Ed Balls well enough to not count on that. He knows that Ed Balls will kick up a fuss, that he's got a parliamentary following of MPs who can be described as maybe pugilistic, and therefore it can be quite a bloody thing to go through. And I think what people also underestimate is that it's not as if he brings nothing at all to the Labour top table. He is pragmatic on issues like business compared to Ed Miliband.
But does he bring enough to the Labour top table to give him, I mean, will people vote for Ed Balls as Chancellor?
Well, I think that's the proposition they're going to be offered, because I don't think there's any likelihood at all. But I think it's impossible to separate the dancer from the dance in politics. It's the message which is the problem. It's not just that Ed Balls had a bad day or he had a bad performance, it's the central economic message has been one which is very difficult to sell, because Labour's been essentially saying we're going to spend our way out of a spending crisis.
And the cost of living issue is losing traction then?
Well, it matters to people, and Labour are more trusted on this than the Conservatives. The big question is whether, two things, is whether the economy in aggregate comes back into alignment with living standards, and second, whether Labour really can possibly define an election on that question when their credibility on the economy is so poor.
I think they can get away with saying that the cost of living is as important or more important than the macroeconomy. They can't get away with saying nothing at all on the macroeconomy.
Thank you both very much indeed.